Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our jointly convened webinar between the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable and the CEO Investor Forum, entitled Is Biopharma Future-Proof? Delighted to have you all on the line today and really looking forward to the conversations with our terrific set of panelists. Also keen to note that this event is sponsored by Cowen and Calvert and Vance company. So I will start along with my colleague from the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable, Sandor, to give just a little overview of the conversation that we're going to have today before we get into Q&A. And I suppose just in the background to this event really is that we're all getting a worldwide uncontrolled experiment in our reliance on the biopharma sector. We're all learning our reliance on that sector to produce, sophisticated vaccines that can be rolled out and produced at scale to help us all through this extremely difficult time that we're living through. This also occurs at a time when the biopharma sector is engaging with ESG issues with increasing seriousness and sophistication, whether or not that's issues such as fair pricing, access to medicines, and increasingly engaging on those sort of broader non-sector specific issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also TCFD and broader climate reporting. And we're also seeing an increasing move by institutional investors to engage on ESG with the biopharma sector. Now, we're specifically convening this event today as a lead-in to our, again, jointly convened CEO Investor Forum, which we're hosting on June 7th and June 8th in concert with the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable, where we'll be having a series of CEOs come and deliver long-term plans embedding ESG into their forward story. The CEOs that we have so far confirmed, potentially with more to follow, include Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, Merck and Takeda, who we have on the line today, along with a number of other CEOs. We'll also have a range of other speakers to speak to the ESG and public policy implications of working in this sector. Now, in preparation for that, we have produced a report with our colleagues at the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable to provide some guidance to the companies that are presenting in that forum, and also to kind of give more context around the importance of ESG and long-termism for this sector. And again, that terrific event will be sponsored by Calvert and Cowen. So that's kind of the lead in to that great event that we have coming up in June. And we'll provide the details of that more broadly to everyone on the line after the call. And we'll also provide access to the underlying report. I just want to highlight the terrific panel of speakers that we have on the line today. Ray Cameron from BlackRock to provide BlackRock's perspective as an institutional investor. We have Brenda Colatrella from Merck, Isabel Torres from Takeda, James Wallace from Novartis. It's a really great set of speakers, and terrific also to have both institutional investors and issuers represented on the line, representing different mix of products and also different geographies. So with that introduction, I wanted to turn over to my colleague from the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable, Sandor, to talk a little bit about the roundtable and a little bit about the lead into the research that we've conducted together.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you for everybody joining us for this call today. The Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable has been running for 8 years. We're in our 9th year now, and our goal really is to provide a platform to connect and support ESG leadership in biopharma companies. Several years ago, we extended the discussion to include a direct dialogue with the investor community, which is such a key audience for our ESG performance. A couple of years ago, through our dialogues, we realized that both groups were having a great deal of frustration with the communication channel about ESG topics and performance. There's a lot of noise in the channel, both due to lack of appropriate standards, lack of appropriate guidance, third parties with various goals. And so our job was to produce a direct dialogue between the biopharma issuers and the investors that read and review that material. So over a period of the last about 2.5 years, almost 3 years now, we've been running what we call the Biopharma Sustainability ESG Communications Initiative, which resulted last April in the publication of a guidance, the Biopharma Investor ESG Communications Guidance, which is a collection of sort of best practices and best thinking about the way to structure that communication, the topics to cover, and in particular, the highest priority topics agreed by both groups, investors and biopharma companies, for telling our story. Since we published that guidance, we've switched our effort to sharing it with the world and trying to move it into practice. And that's how our connection with the folks at CECP and the CEO Investor Forum got started. That's an opportunity to put some of our ESG thinking into practice by embedding it into the long-term planning process and sharing it through the forward-looking vision of the CEOs. And clearly, we sort of hit a nerve in this last year with everything that's going on. We've had just a tremendous response both to this forum today and to the CEO forum coming up. And we think that this will just be a great example of connecting sustainability related concerns with investor relations, with investor concerns, and putting that all at the service of a better forward-looking vision for the companies. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Brian so we can get some of the folks who are part of our panel to talk about their experience and interest.
Yeah, and just very quickly on the research that we've produced, which we'll share with you, that is an opportunity for us to really just embed the work that the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable have been doing with their issuers and institutional investors, and the work that we've been doing at the CEO Investor Forum on our long-term planning framework. That's a investor relations communications tool that we've been using to work with 35 plus companies to date to enable them to share a longer term time horizon in their investor relations toolkit. And what our combined guidance essentially does is to take the different inputs that we have on ESG and long-termism and combine them in a way to enable issuers to engage with these issues and hopefully simplify what can look like a very complex disclosure landscape. And I think it's really important as well that companies do try to engage with ESG issues on a sector-specific basis, because we do know that the materiality of ESG issues varies systematically by sector. If Facebook are talking about ESG in exactly the same way that Exxon are talking about ESG, something has probably gone slightly wrong in terms of the way in which issues are being discussed. So in this case, what we've sought to do is provide some really specific guidance to this sector. And I think you'll see some of that guidance reflected in the presentations that we have in June. And we hope that the white paper is also of interest and is of use to other issuers in the sector who, though may not be presenting in June, are also dealing with the same sets of pressures from stakeholders and institutional investors to engage with ESG with increasing degrees of sophistication. And we'll talk about that with our panelists. So with that introduction, Sandor, do you want to kick off the first line of Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. So our goal is really to have the practitioners speak today. So the first question I'm going to put is to Brenda Colatrella from Merck to just talk a little bit about what the genesis of the ESG reporting function within Merck and your experience with both the roundtable and the initiative and why your CEO thinks it's a good idea to participate in the forum that's coming up. Brenda.
Yeah, first of all, let me just thank you, Sandra and Brian, for hosting this important conversation and for inviting Merck to share our experiences and our perspectives on this topic. So, as you know, Merck has a long history of corporate responsibility, and we've actually been reporting on our ESG progress and performance for, I think it's about 15 years now. I think our first report was published back in 2006. But that said, our reporting has certainly evolved considerably over these last 15 years, just given the rising interest in ESG, but also I think a broader understanding of the importance of ESG from a business perspective and as a business imperative. There's also been a proliferation, as we all know, of reporting frameworks and ratings and rankings. So all of that has really caused us, over the years to think about the information that we're communicating, the information that we're reporting on. And along those lines, our efforts to integrate ESG into our business have also certainly accelerated. Interestingly, last year, we decided to formalize our approach through something we're calling an ESG roadmap. And we put together this roadmap so that we would focus on advancing ESG from a reporting and communications perspective, but also from a governance, risk management, all of the components that we think are essential to ensuring that we're building a strong ESG performance and profile. And I will say that doing that has helped us to engage our internal subject matter experts, and particularly those that are focused on the long-term planning for the company. So it's really facilitated those conversations and has helped us to put information out there that is meaningful. And that's really our focus, trying to evolve our reporting so that it is more meaningful and more data evidenced. Our interaction with the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable in particular has been really helpful in this regard. Learning from our peers, the communications guidance that you mentioned, I think helps us think about how we can simplify and again, be more meaningful in our reporting, but also how we can think further about our ESG strategy. And the CECP long-term plan framework has also helped us to really think about, what are the trends out there? What are investors and other stakeholders interested in? So I think that, the combination of those two, and of course, the reporting frameworks that are available to us have helped us to really think about not only how do we report in a more meaningful way, but also how do we take this and integrate it into the risk management of the company? How do we identify opportunities from a long-term perspective? And I think our senior management, including our CEO, have really recognized the importance. And I think they always really understood the importance of these issues. I don't know that they've thought about them in terms of ESG. So it's a new lexicon in some ways, but I think the issues themselves have always been front and center, particularly from a risk management perspective, but also from an opportunity to ensure the long-term viability of our business. And then lastly, I'll say, the environmental forces. This is a dynamic area. We're constantly learning, pivoting, listening, learning some more. So the dynamics of all this are certainly impacted by what's happening in the external environment. And 2020, certainly showed us with the pandemic, the social injustice movement. Both of those have, I think, really highlighted the importance of taking into consideration what's happening in the external environment into our planning and our reporting, and has also highlighted the importance of our industry in terms of addressing some of these global challenges. So I think all of those factors combined have really forced us to continue to think about what are we doing in terms of our communications, how can we streamline it, how can we make it more meaningful, and then perhaps more importantly, how do we integrate this into our business in a seamless way that speaks to our long-term strategy as a company.
Thank you, Brenda.
All
right.
And I wanted to actually see if we could get a sort of similar introductory perspective from Isabel and James. and sort of respond to some of those points that Brenda has raised. Isabel, do you want to lead off?
Hi, I would like also to thank you for the opportunity to be here. And Brenda, I think you said quite a lot in a certain way. I think you kind of summarized the journey that all of us are going through. I think if I can try to find out the specificity or something important to Takeda is Takeda. So this year we do 240 years. So as you were saying, in a certain way, sustainability has been always in the core of everything we do and the values that we have. But the wording, I agree that maybe we will not use the same wording, but we continue to focus, and we have always done, in terms of societal impact and value. And it's something that is quite close to our strategy and to our way of thinking and to our way that we want to embed the sustainability in the business. So I pick up again what Brenda said. I think that's what is our now main mission, is how can we embed and how can all the actions that we have in the business and in the functions and in the risk management, we can think about ESGs. So I think we are beginning this journey in the Takeda. We also have worked quite a lot on that time we called integrated report, by the way, in 2016, but now we are coming back to the integrated report. So I think the data is something that is quite important also, and it's something that I'm learning quite a lot because I've joined this position last month. So I've worked many years in access, but it was also the impact that we can have in society and how can we measure value-based healthcare, how can we create frameworks to measure this impact. But I think the data and how can we standardize this data? How can we use all of us the same kind of standards? How can we speak the same language with investors? It's something that I think it's a challenge, at least it seems so for my first approach. So this is something that we should kind of work together, and that's one of the, I think, the main objectives here also, is to understand what the stakeholders and now the investors, like Ray, for example, what they are looking for. I think, Brian, you were saying it's true. We cannot have the same answers as all industry. We are quite specific. Biopharmaceutical is a quite specific industry. So how can we answer? And how can we show what we are doing also?
That's great. Thanks so much, Isabel. And James, to perhaps get a sense of Novartis's journey also.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, you have to echo the comments of Brenda and Isabel sort of again, of course. But you know, to touch on a few things, certainly, you know, the investor interest over the last few years has been remarkable in terms of the increase and sometimes the specificity of, you know, what is being asked, you know, from Ray's organization, the requirement for TCFD, which I'm sure we're all trying to comply with, and we're all on that journey as well. And that's a real long-term challenge we have about how do you get the data project, you know, up to 30 years in advance under different global warming potentials, and how does the health issues change over that time, and how do you then monetize it? It's like a huge challenge we're all facing. And you know, the big societal goals we just mentioned, the sustainable development goals up to 2030, how do we show that our revenues are aligned to this? You know, really sort of meaty challenges we get into, and at the same time trying to make it sort of fit with the business, as Isabel was saying, make it seem logical and part of the brand. But you know, I liked, you know, really like one thing about the CECP guidance, and many of the elements in it are actually very similar to the integrated reporting framework, I thought. And you know, that commonality, I don't know whether that was coincidence or by chance, but you know, you can see, and as we're going through that process ourselves and Novartis to try to consolidate and integrate more of our reporting, you know, that kind of cliche about the integrated thinking that develops out of that. And, you know, we're kind of like the tail on the dog, and we're kind of wagging the dog a little bit now that we're forcing all these functions to actually kind of align a little bit more for the first time. And that's really sort of stimulating some very interesting discussions, some interesting challenges, and combined with the investor sort of interest that they're sort of, that they're wanting more, wanting to push us, but they don't always know how. And that's why I guess the biopharma collective is such an important thing, to try to bring that sort of collaboration together to understand the challenges.
Yeah, that's such helpful commentary, particularly that piece's kind of disclosure as forcing function almost. We certainly see that in our work with companies, where very often when we first talk to a company about delivering a long-term plan, there isn't that connective tissue within the organization for investor relations and corporate sustainability to talk about these issues in a way which is relevant for both those communities. And so doing that level set internally, working out, what we're disclosing where and why, those are really important conversations. And also I think that having those conversations then helps meet the informational needs of investors, because you're then going to start disclosing in a way that's actually more targeted and more focused. So thank you, James, for mentioning investors, because that brings us to Ray. And I wanted to bring you into the conversation, Ray. BlackRock has such a remarkably significant role to play here in sort of pushing ESG along in your significant portfolio of companies. And I suppose I wanted to get a couple of kind of perspectives, from you. Is I suppose the first is, what kind of is the key driving such focus on ESG at BlackRock? And I suppose just at its meta level, what are you really looking for from the companies that you're engaging with, and particularly in this sector?
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Sandra, for giving me an opportunity to speak on behalf of BlackRock today. First of all, I must say that I'm not sure that you could have had a better table setter than Brenda in terms of really focusing on and laying out kind of a journey and kind of pros and cons and issues. So I think she did a fantastic job. And then Isabel's comments and James's comments as well. I think you've really done a fantastic job, quite frankly, of kind of highlighting and really table setting. From an investor perspective, one of the things that I mentioned to Brian, and I often mention to him when I'm speaking on one of the panels, is that, BlackRock is just one voice among the investors. And so there are a lot of different voices in the investment community. But we think about, these ESG issues, quite frankly, through a longer term lens. One of the things that we really try to encourage companies to focus on is a longer term perspective. And that's a view that we've had for a long time. When you think about, for example, the letters that Larry Fink sends out to CEOs, he started doing that, quite frankly, to encourage companies to be bold in making decisions through a longer lens, as opposed to really being caught up in the quarter to quarter focus that was evident in the marketplace through a lot of different forces. He wanted the companies to understand that there were investors who were very much a part of their stakeholder base, who wanted them and encouraged them to take a longer perspective, as opposed to being myopically focused on the quarter to quarter results. I think the work that CECP is doing to encourage companies to really release those, the longer term plans is critically important. And the foundational work that they've done in terms of encouraging companies and laying out a roadmap for that is really important work. I know that we're very much aligned in that perspective. And for Sander and that organization, just in terms of providing an opportunity for us to come together and really to provide a forum for thought leadership, to think about some of the emerging topics, and to also hear some of the best practices and some of the challenges, quite frankly, that industry participants are really grappling with. I think it's an important forum. And so, this collective work is critically important. From an investor perspective, Brian, you ask why. When we engage with companies, it's really to understand how they're thinking about risk. It's not just the risk assessment and the risk mitigation, but also opportunities around that. So, for a long time, we've engaged around 5 different engagement priorities. And you can kind of pull those up, broadly speaking, into ESG. But I would, just as a commercial advertisement, we actually released this morning our enhanced and updated 2021 engagement priorities and commentaries along with those. And so there's an evergreen component to them, but our 2021 priorities are board quality and effectiveness, climate and natural capital, which is an expanded focus for us in terms of natural capital, strategy, purpose, and financial resilience. Obviously, that is really focusing in on the purpose of the organization, which informs culture, which informs the long-term strategy, which we really want to understand how companies are thinking about that. Incentives align with value creation. That's kind of a new wrapper, if you will, for executive compensation. And then company impacts on people and human capital. We've already noticed, and I know that everyone on this call and the participants as well in the audience are very much aware of how that particular topic has been kind of pulled to the forefront in a very forceful way over the past 12 months or so. So the reason that we focus on these topics is because we think that they're critically important in terms of how the company is thinking about its long-term prospects, quite frankly. From the seat that we sit in as an asset manager, we know that we're not the asset owners, right? We're the asset managers, and we're representing voices of a number of a lot of clients, quite frankly, who look to us to help them meet their retirement goals. And so we take that responsibility very seriously, and it's really important for the companies, for you all, quite frank, companies on this panel, and you're in the audience as well, to be around in the 20, 30 years where some of these retirement goals are going to be realized, and for the clients that we represent to be able to achieve those goals. In addition to that, it's really important for us to understand how you are assessing these risks. And increasingly, the stock market is attributing, quite frankly, a premium, if you will, to those organizations and to those companies who are embracing these topics. We saw that in spades last year, and that's continuing through the early parts of this year as well. So Larry talked about an ESG or sustainability premium that companies would be afforded, and we're starting to see some of that just in the performance over the last 12 months, not only in terms of industry, but in terms of the companies within the industries as well, those who are embracing these ESG strategies and those who are not. And when I say embracing, we understand that it's a journey, right? Every company is at a different starting point, but it's important to start that journey and to articulate where you are in that journey and your thinking around it to the investment community. So the frameworks, TCFD and SASB, we think that they're really important in terms of providing data and materially relevant data that investors can use to make decisions around. That's one of the reasons that we support both of those frameworks and encourage companies to, if they're not reporting specifically to TCFD and SASB, to at least provide the alignment and the mapping so that investors can easily assess and digest that information. But the data is really only a part of the story, because we know the data just gives you a snapshot in a point in time, right? The narrative around it is critically important. And that's why, we really value engagements as well. Understanding how companies are thinking about these critical topics, how they are, the plans that they have in terms of moving forward, and some of the challenges, quite frankly, that they're having in terms of integrating it throughout the organization. And as Brenda said, these aren't new topics, right? When you think about human capital management, people are critically important to operations of any company. When you think about environmental risk, particularly in the healthcare sector, which I think has really shown its collaborative nature, not only this year, but historically as well, and having a stakeholder focus, really understanding, the stakeholders that they have to give some consideration to in terms of the decision making. I think the healthcare sector is one that really does embrace that. So, this information is really important for us to be able to understand where companies are and to impute value, quite frankly, in terms of those companies who are really embracing this journey. And I think the market is really starting to be a dividing place, if you will, in terms of those companies that are not embracing it. The other point that I would make is that, we just, that sometimes is overlooked. I think sometimes that we forget what a technology-driven world that we operate in. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that the world is a very small place, and transparency is really important. And so articulating your story so that the global investor landscape can understand kind of where you are, what your values are, how you are supporting those values and how you're executing on those, and the long-term planning around that is critically important because of the transparent world that we live in a much smaller world. So, it's just a point that I would underscore, and that is that, the reason that we're asking for this information is, number one, so we can understand where you are, but the reality is we just live in a more transparent world. And so, it doesn't serve companies well to kind of have their head in the sand anymore, because if you're not providing the narrative, the market or some of those third party, ESG providers, they will basically gene splice information on your behalf. And you may not like, the creature that kind of comes out on the other side of that. So I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Ray. That was a marvelous summary. Really appreciate that. So one of the things I'd like to point out is the guidance that we've been putting together in collaboration with both the investor and the biopharma community is very closely linked with our colleagues at, microphone. So is very closely linked with our colleagues at SASB, and the TCFD guidance has also been part of our reference. But part of what we're trying to do is to expand the dialogue beyond the financially material, sort of largely backward-looking metrics that are part of the standard already, and expand it into more forward-looking and more contextual issues as well. That's why we use this terminology of high priority topics that may become material in a strictly financial sense in the future, but are already important or emerging as drivers of corporate performance. Based on the things that Ray said, James, do you want to take a moment and talk about what Novartis has been doing in terms of actually driving more forward-looking reporting? You guys have been a leader in this area. Perhaps you can share what your perspective has been for a few minutes.
Sure. Well, our colleague Sonia Hout has been sort of really instrumental, and with the Value Balancing Alliance, really trying to sort of look at our internal data and the wider societal impact of Novartis as a business, both sort of environmental and social impacts. And, you know, they're doing lots of clever work with institutes using various economic proxies and modeling that you can then sort of take that base data, project it in different ways. And that's really interesting. But, you know, again, it is an evolution. It needs a lot of work to make it sort of really, you know, stand up to scrutiny. You know, if you take the issue of access and sort of that sort of impacts measurement and management, it can do part of that agenda, sort of certainly in the low middle income countries, better than it can in sort of a more of a developed country setting for access in that context too. So, you know, it's really been a great journey the team has been on, and they're doing some wonderful things, but, you know, it's in its infancy, of course. You know, this is combined also with the materiality process, which we're currently running at the moment, and that's always a big challenge. And the stakeholder inputs is something that really helps to drive both the strategy and the reporting context of, you know, the kind of messaging you end up coming out with to the different stakeholders. So this has been an important part. And again, Denise has done a great job of this in the past, you know, really sort of some groundbreaking stuff there. You know, as we're also looking ahead, as I mentioned, TCFD is a big thing for us, as is everyone. And, you know, I think the physical risk side is not too much of a challenge, but transition risk is where it really becomes a tough proposition, because, you know, under those different global warming scenarios, is there anyone who really has that sort of data to say this is going to help the disease and vectors and the health systems of countries will change over time, that then we can, you know, align with our potential business model and strategy, and how can we actually sort of interpret that into a logical sort of quantified output? That's a big challenge we face ahead of us. And as well, you know, the SDG impact, you know, some other investors take this very much one size fits all approach to assessment of data and projection of data, which, you know, sometimes you'll win on some methodologies like the social ones, but if you've been compared on green across everything, usually healthcare comes out as a bit of a loser in comparison, you know, on green revenues and things. So, you know, these forward-looking investment houses that are trying to do it, again, they're all experimenting. You know, Ray mentioned the creature that comes out the other side, and yeah, sometimes it's not a great thing, but, you know, we're all trying in this context to sort of trying to improve this forward-looking data that will allow us to have the targets, the strategy, the KPIs all linked to the purpose. But, you know, it's a tough thing, and we're all trying.
Yeah, thank you. And Brenda, would you mind picking up from there a little bit and maybe talking about the experience that you've been having as you've changed and updated the way you do reporting, and as you're following a path to having sort of a more impact and outcomes perspective? Have you actually seen a change in the response that you get from the investor community, or your ability to put the ESG story at Merck out?
Yeah, Thanks, Sander. So just to build on what James was saying, he mentioned materiality assessments, and I think those are really important in terms of focus. And I will get to your question in a second, but I also want to just highlight that something Ray said about stakeholder engagement. I think for us, one of the most valuable things that we've done over the last 2 years is to engage more frequently with investors and with other stakeholders to understand more specifically what they're looking for and what matters to them, and then to ensure that we're integrating that both into our reporting and our planning. So I just wanted to highlight those two issues. In terms of your question, Sander, I think we're moving more towards this idea of transparency, and I certainly agree with that, and data. I also agree that the narrative is important, and we need to kind of tell our story so others don't tell it for us. But one thing that we did 2 years ago is we recognized that there was a need for targeting different audiences in terms of our ESG reporting. And we created a separate ESG performance or progress report that was supplemental to our larger online corporate responsibility report. And the investor response to that was really, really positive, and we were very happy to see that, because we felt like we listened to what investors were saying and thought, okay, we need something that's more targeted. They didn't want to have to sift through the storytelling and some of the other narrative on our broader website. And that storytelling has its place. There are audiences out there that really want to understand what we're doing from more of that perspective. But for investors, what we heard was, we want to see data, we want narrative, but we don't want an overabundance of narrative. So we came forward with this ESG supplemental report, and the investor response to that has been really positive. And in fact, as we move forward, that will probably play a more central role in our reporting. We'll still include narrative. We still want to put out some information about what our employees, for example, are doing to support their communities, everything that speaks to the company and its employees as being responsible and good corporate citizens. But this idea of targeting audiences in this way was something that we decided to try about 2 years ago, and the investor response to that has been really positive. And then I'll just say, in general, I think investors are looking for more, in particular, looking for more meaningful data. So our ability to enhance our disclosures. I think we were either the first or one of the first companies to publish our EEO1 data. And again, we get a very positive response when we're being more transparent about the issues that matter.
Great. Thank you. Excellent. Maybe this is a good moment to ask Ray back on the line for a moment, since you're the recipient of all this material. One of the issues that we talked about that drove the whole initiative so far has been not only to improve the quality and value of the information that gets reported, but to streamline the communication channel a little bit. It's been very challenging for many of the biopharma companies to respond to all the different requests for information and the varied way it's asked for. But I don't know if everyone is aware, we have the mirror image issue inside the investment houses as well, with their industry and ESG analysts. Ray, could you talk just a little bit to how the guidance and other frameworks may be supporting your team's ability to do the analysis and the data gathering, and what kind of changes you've seen or are looking for to come yet?
Well, thank you, Sander. I mean, that was one of the reasons after a number of years of engaging and companies actually asking us what information was materially relevant in terms of decision making. That's quite frankly one of the reasons that we started to publicly announce our support around TCFD and SASB. And again, there are a ton of frameworks out there, but we find SASB in particular, for example, and its industry focus to really hone in on not for all investors, but for materially relevant information that is decision useful. And so that's one of the reasons that we decided to put our support there publicly, because we do think that the clarity around that important information is important for comparability in terms of data analysis, not only in terms of peer-to-peer analysis, but also to be able to understand what kind of progress the company is making over time, just in terms of benchmarking. And so we think the quality of the data, certainly there's a lot to be said about the improvements there, but we think the consistency around it as well. And so as you start to hone in on a couple of frameworks, as opposed to 20 or 30 of them, if not more, if you start to hone in on a few of them, it really starts to allow the investors and also the companies, quite frankly, to understand how they can streamline and really focus their resources. And let's be clear. I mean, everyone doesn't have the luxury of having the resources of a large cap company, right? To be able to focus on all of these reporting issues. So we understand that can be really challenging. And so that is, quite frankly, that was one of the impetuses for us to really help to lend our voice, to provide a little bit of clarity in what we think is important. And since we made the announcement a couple of years ago with respect to SASB and TCFD, you've had a number of other organizations lend their support as well in terms of endorsements. But importantly, there is a significant amount of movement just over the last 6 months in terms of clarity around frameworks. And so we're very, very encouraged, quite frankly, by the movement around that. And so we think that's going to, hopefully that'll continue to gain movement as well. And this will be helpful not only for us in terms of the quality and consistency of information that we receive, but it will also be helpful for the issuers, for the companies as well, in being able to really focus their resources.
Okay, thank you. But one more question for Isabel. You are a little earlier in your journey and are thinking more prospectively about the changes you'd like to be making in the way you communicate with the investment community and other stakeholders. Can you talk a little bit about, just sort of the step that you're on, because many of the folks on the line are also early or maybe even haven't started moving down this path too far. So your perspective could be really valuable too.
Thank you, Sander. So it's been quite interesting, the discussion, because I think you have kind of touched all the points and all the questions that we are going through. So we have beginning with the materiality assessment in 2019, so last year, and we are to understand and to begin to address what are the no financial issues. What no financial issues are important strategically to the company, to our company, and to our stakeholders. And the idea was that the assessment will result in what we call a purpose-led sustainability framework. So we have tried to split between 3 groups: planet, people, and patient. And the patient, of course, related, as James said, with many of the access parts and the data that we can kind of figure it out, what can we bring to the society. And we have created these 3 pillars, and we have tried to begin to address the purpose, the vision, the values, the business imperatives. And now when we look at that, we begin to say, okay, we have to measure, right? If you don't measure this, what you don't measure is not done. So we have begin to create metrics, and we are trying to understand which data and how can we see this, what is the value of this data also. And I think one of the challenges at the farm that we are having is how can we see this data evolving? Which kind of targets are the investors looking to make this evolve? So we are as you were saying, Sandra, a little bit trying to establish the baseline and trying to understand how this baseline is important to our investors and to the stakeholders and to the patients. How can we move also this on? But now we have to begin to also to establish what are the targets, where we want to be, where the investors would like that we should be, and where as a company, with this strategy that we have created, where we would like to be and where we can be in the next 240 years. So I think we are in this journey that is not an easy one, because responding also to Ray, this is to standardize and to see exactly what are expected from a biopharmaceutical company. It's not so easy. It's not so in certain parts. I will say, for example, in access, I think we all know what is the direction that we should take. In terms of the planet, we begin to have, and Takeda has announced also our carbon neutrality goals, but still we are kind of figuring out what is the target, where we want to be in the future.
All right, thank you. I think one of the points.
I was just going to say, Isabel, it's interesting. You know, we talk about target setting for 20 or 30 years, and you're looking at things through a 200-year lens. So it's just a very different perspective to bring to the table.
It's a Japanese perspective. Let's do like that.
Yeah, talk about a long-term plan.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point out that, Isabel, you touched on something very important. There are a number of areas where current standards don't really do the job, and access is one of these areas that's really unique to our sector, where, as you say, the outcomes that we all want are pretty clear and non-controversial, but how to measure it in a meaningful way is really difficult. And that's some of the work that our initiative is currently working on and will be working on into the future there. Brian, you haven't had a chance to get a word in.
So yeah, look, in the last 15 minutes or so, I wanted to first say, people on the line, feel free to submit questions through the chat function. If there's any questions you'd like to submit, we'll take a look at those. And also, we have a lot of issuers on the line here. People will be at different stages of their journey on ESG and purpose and long-termism. And you've all provided terrific perspectives on your ESG journey so far. It'd be great to get a sense from each of the issuers, some recommendations for other issuers on the line about how you get this started, what are the key internal things that have to happen to make progress, and how do you then keep kind of momentum? So a little sense of that perspective, how this has gone. And I think that will help sort of amplify some of the points that have come up in the webinar so far. So perhaps let's start with James.
Sure. And, I think there are certain things which are key to any kind of company from any sector on this journey. And, in an ideal world, your CEO's buy-in and support is very critical to make this. You sometimes find in the smaller companies, you either get a very committed CEO or you get one who's like, okay, as long as it works for the business, and that really will determine how far and how quickly you can go, and making sure it's aligned to the business. I think that's really important. And I think building consensus, some of these ESG issues, they cut across so many teams, departments, functions, even beyond the company. And you really need to build your approach in terms of what targets you set, what you're going to do in your programs. And you have to almost go by consensus, and that's a critical thing. So having that wider buy-in into at least the development of a strategy and formulating it to go forward is really key as well. So I think those are two key things. And the other thing I would say is with the stakeholder in mind, and if your stakeholder is the investor community and some of the wider ESG rating agencies, make your reporting work harder for those. There are ways to sort of make it smarter, to tag the various things if some of these sort of benchmarks and types of scores or certain stakeholders are important to you. So really make your ratings and reporting work together, as well as showing the important long-term value creation story as well.
That's great. Thanks so much, James. Brenda?
Yeah, so James actually touched on quite a few of the key ones, and there's so many in my head that I'm gonna try to be sort of robust but brief. So I think first and foremost, I would say don't chase every framework, rating, ranking out there. I think Ray made this point earlier about being being selective. Focus and simplification, both in your reporting and sometimes even in your approach, probably works best. Making sure that you're meaningful and streamlined. I would say also take advantage of the tools that are out there. The reporting frameworks and the ratings and rankings are useful, as is what we were talking about here today, the communications guidance from the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable, as well as CECP's long-term plan framework. But you also have to include judgment in that. So there are tools out there, but you also have to really dig deep and understand, you know, what matters most for your particular industry, for your company, and focus there. I would say again, and I don't think I can emphasize this enough, engage directly, both with investors and external stakeholders, and internally, and James made this point, making sure you have that buy-in and that collaboration internally. Data and measurement certainly matter, and Isabel talked about this in terms of, you know, setting metrics, setting goals, and being able to report not only on your progress, but to, you know, demonstrate the impact of what you're doing. You know, the roadmap that I mentioned earlier that we created last year, I think has been really helpful in helping us to focus and drill more deeply on the areas that matter, the gaps, the opportunities that we've identified. And then finally, and one of my staff said this just the other day, you know, this idea of embracing being a change agent. And I thought that was a really interesting concept, because I think for many of us, that's what we are in our companies. This is a very dynamic, evolving field. You know, at one point years ago, it was more about the social. Now it's clearly about not only the social, but the, you know, the business imperative involved in it. So recognize that some of the external things that are happening, the external forces, can certainly help you drive change within your organization. So those are the ones that are top of mind.
And Isabel, as the final issuer on the line, do you want to add to that?
It's difficult to add something to what Brenda and James said already. So if I can take something, because I think that's also something that we should use more, is these platforms like the Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable that we can discuss between pharma, because we are specific in a, you know, biopharma is a specific industry. So we should eventually, we use also IFPMA and also other institutions to kind of share more. And when we, for example, when we are speaking about the societal impact, maybe we should measure in the same way. Maybe, you know, if we begin to look to this state and to this measuring part in the same standard way, maybe we could win together when we speak with the external stakeholders, also like the investors and so on. I think also what I've taken from this, and I think I will take it as an advice for my next, not 240 years, Ray, but a few more, is that we have to build strong partnerships internally also. Because as you say, Brenda, this is, however, this is not new issues or new subjects, but sometimes it's just the language can be a little bit, so we have to build, I will take that from me now, to my new job also, to take strong partnerships internally to make the things move as quick as possible. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ray, I'd like to spring from the comments that everyone just made back to a question to you. Is the world that we live in is not static. We're not only on our own journey to improve reporting and disclosures in the way that sustainability is integrated into long-term planning within our businesses, but the whole regulatory and reporting world is also evolving around us. Perhaps you can take a moment and comment on how that looks from your point of view, where you think that's helpful and where you have some concerns that companies on the line should really be thinking about.
Well, I think it's a good question, and I would say that, you know, watch the space, so to speak, simply because things are moving so quickly. We know that, you know, I'll speak from somewhat of a U.S. perspective. You know, we see some of the trends that are, some of the signs that are trending, shall we say, in the U.S. with the new administration, particularly around ESG, embracing ESG and reporting in particular. So watch this space. There is some very definite movement, and so I think that it has broad implications, not only for the investment community, but certainly for the issuers as well. And so we're certainly watching that and hopeful that we can be a part of those, you know, conversations in terms of direction of travel as well. I think we have a clear understanding or clear sense of kind of the landscape, if you will, in terms of Europe and the evolving landscape in parts of Asia and Asia Pac as well. So there's a tremendous amount of movement and focus in terms of ESG, particularly if you think around, if you focus on the climate component of it as well. But what we're seeing in the U.S., and we're watching it very closely, and again, hope to be a part of those conversations, is that there is definite movement and in terms of a more ESG reporting. So we'll see how that shakes out. But you know, I think that we can certainly, if we fast forward a year or so from now, I certainly think that there will be more components in place that have more guidance, if not specific requirements from expectations from the government in terms of the type of information that is kind of baseline, if you will, that will be expected of issuers. And because BlackRock is a public company, will certainly be a part of that as well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I guess I'll just take one moment to emphasize that the initiative that resulted in the ESG communications guidance and in the integrated work that we produced together with our friends at CECP is continuing. And that's one of the issues that we're looking at, is how to engage properly with all these evolving frameworks and respond to them in a useful way. And I think with that, looking at the clock, I'll turn it back over to Brian to wrap up a little bit here.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandor. And thanks everyone for the just the absolutely terrific conversation. I won't try to fully summarize it, but I will just say that, institutional investors really and issuers, they sit in connected ecosystems, and issuers really need to manage their own internal ecosystem, unsilo ESG, ensure teams are communicating and sharing data in the way that they need to. But then they also need to be interacting with institutional investors to understand their informational needs, and also interacting with their other stakeholders in a way to understand their informational needs. And I think the problem often has been with ESG is it's sort of been presented as a kind of cloud of undifferentiated information. And obviously what the different reporting frameworks and the different audiences and the different understandings of what materiality means indicate that actually we're talking about somewhat different types of information to different people and meeting different informational needs, and just sort of navigating that framework. It is a challenge, but hopefully through the BSRT and ourselves, we have added to the project to simplify that guidance rather than to complicate it. So just in the final moments, I would add, obviously, again, we have our CEO Investor Forum coming up in June on the 7th and the 8th. If your CEO hasn't yet committed to present a long-term plan, I'd encourage you to do so. Feel free to connect with myself, Sandor, or another member of the CEO Investor Forum team. There'll be a range of different activities in the run-up to that event. We also assist the companies to build their presentations in the run-up to June. So we'll be working with them to share our guidance, walk them through that guidance, and then help them optimize their disclosures in the run-up to June. So again, if you are interested in engaging with the forum, do reach out to us. Otherwise, any final comments from you, Sandor?
Yeah, and don't forget our new report on integrating ESG into long-term planning is available as a pre-release for people on the call. The Biopharma Sustainability Roundtable, as of this morning, has a website, and the document is available there as well as on the CECP website. So please do get a copy of that and read through it and see if that's useful to you, and let us know what you're thinking.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you all. Thanks everyone on the line. Thanks to our terrific panel of speakers. Have a good day, everyone, wherever you are.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been marvelous.
Complete the NPS.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Have up there. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.